In order for the cross bridge cycle to happen, we obviously need ATP so that the myosin head can break it down. So, in order to do that, that ATP supplies the energy that's needed to move and detach cross bridges. It's also needed to pump calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is one reason for rigor mortis, because obviously that ATP is not going to be present at the point of death, so that calcium cannot go from the sarcoplasm back into storage. Also, ATP is needed to pump sodium out of the cell and potassium back in after excitation contraction coupling. That's the sodium potassium a, ATPase pump that you learned about earlier in the semester. So we have ATP that's available for only about 4 to 6 seconds. So what that means is that ATP must be regenerated very, very quickly. And there's really kind of three ways that this is done. The first immediate way is through what's called direct phosphorylation by creatine phosphate. And that's basically the word phosphorylation really just means adding a phosphate here. So we're going from ADP back to ATP that then can be used to be broken down by the myosin. So the creatine phosphate is a unique molecule that's already in muscle fibers, and it donates a phosphate to ADP to instantly form ATP. So this is the same creatine that you can go to the store and buy, but you don't need to because we already have it in our muscle fibers. The enzyme here is called creatine kinase, and it carries out this transfer of the phosphate. So the muscle fibers do have enough ATP and creatine phosphate reserves for 15 seconds. So what that means is there's 4 to 6 initial seconds, but after that, for 15 seconds, we need creatine phosphate. So creatine phosphate's added to ADP to make creatine and ATP. Basically, it's kind of like a shuttle where the phosphate from this molecule is transferred or shuttled to ADP to generate ATP. And that 1 ATP is produced per creatine phosphate. The next way to generate ATP is through the anaerobic pathway. Anaerobic means without energy, or I'm sorry, without oxygen. The ATP is generated by breaking down and using energy stored in that glucose. So the first thing that happens is what's called glycolysis. You don't need to know all the steps of glycolysis or anything like that. But glucose is eventually converted to two pyruvic acids, and the net result of that is the two ATPs are produced because of that reaction. So it produces a little more energy than the creatine phosphate, but not that much. So normally, pyruvic acid enters the mitochondria to start aerobic respiration, but since we don't have oxygen, that can't happen. So this occurs when no mitochondria are present. So it's called an anaerobic atmosphere. So the anaerobic glycolysis is where pyruvic acid then is converted to lactic acid. And lactic acid goes into the bloodstream and it starts to lower the pH and can lead to the burning sensation that we get in our muscles from anaerobic respiration. So the lactic acid goes in the bloodstream, is used as fuel by the liver, kidneys, and heart, but it can be converted back into pyruvic acid or the glucose by the liver. So the anaerobic respiration yields only 5% as much ATP as aerobic respiration, but it produces ATP much faster. So this type of metabolism, anaerobic pathway, would be used for a period of about 30 to 40 seconds, something like a sprint maybe, or a very powerful movement like hitting a baseball would be an example of this. When more ATP is produced, it's called aerobic respiration because, as you can see from this image, we have the mitochondria that's present. It produces 95% of the ATP during rest and light to moderate exercise. So it's slower than the anaerobic pathway, but it produces so much more. It consists of chemical reactions that occur in the mitochondria and require oxygen. So it breaks glucose down into carbon dioxide, water, and large amounts of ATP, which would be 32 total ATP. So this part right here, we see an anaerobic respiration, except the pyruvic acid is converted into lactic acid. However, when we have the mitochondria here, the fuels that are used could include the glucose broken down from glycogen, which is stored in the muscle fiber, but it could also use other things like fatty acids, which are available after 30 minutes of exercise, or it could also include amino acids. So this supplies enough energy that could continue for hours. So somebody running a marathon would use the aerobic pathway. So when we compare this, for this image here, we see short duration, high intensity exercise, and that's from not only creatine phosphate, but also anaerobic. So the first 6 seconds are already the ATP that's stored in the muscle. Then we have direct phosphorylation from creatine phosphate for the next 10 seconds. So we have a total of about 15 to 16 seconds. And remember that phosphorylation simply means transfer of the phosphate. Then for the next 30 to 40 seconds, the glycogen that's in the muscles broken down into glucose, and that's oxidized to generate ATP. But remember, one glucose only produces 2 ATP. So it's really not meant for longer exercise than this. So the type of exercise, the type of fibers here that we'll be talking about in upcoming videos is called fast twitch or fast glycolytic fibers. They metabolize anaerobically. For prolonged duration exercise, which can go on for hours, the ATP is generated by breakdown of several nutrient fuels aerobically. And this is an additional 32 ATP. And we would see this in muscle fibers that are called slow twitch or slow oxidative. And they're called oxidative primarily because oxygen's available and we have mitochondria that's present in those fibers. Muscle fatigue then occurs when there is an inability to contract despite continuous stimulation. So reasons for this could be ionic imbalances causing fatigue, levels of potassium, sodium, or calcium can disrupt membrane potentials of the muscle cell. There could be increased inorganic phosphate from creatine phosphate and ATP breakdown that may interfere with calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. There could be decreased ATP or increased magnesium. decreased glycogen, which is the large polysaccharide that breaks down into glucose. So the lack of ATP is rarely the reason for fatigue, except in severely stressed muscles.